So we have already covered the abortion from the historical and from the legal point of view. And now we have to address another important topic, which is the political and social consequences for Europe of the idea of recognizing, of integrating the abortion as a fundamental right in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So this is going to be our third panel, and for this panel we also have a number of experts, which are going to be led by Nuno Melo. Nuno Melo is a member of the European Parliament, of the European Popular Party. And then we have also Christian Frey, who is coming from Germany. He's a theologist and an ethicist, if I'm properly informed. We have Isabel Benjumea, who is also a member of the European Parliament, also in the APP group. And we have Imre von Habsburg, who is also a president of a very important initiative, which is called European Fraternity, who is also an interesting and growing initiative. And finally, we have Miriam Lexman to complete our panel, who is also a member of the European Popular Party. So thank you very much for coming. I leave you the floor. So please, Nuno, feel free to start.
Well, first of all, I want to thank very much to Jaime Mayor-Aregua for the invitation to be here, and to Alfonso Bullón from CHU, and to salute all my colleagues in this debate. And well, even being the chair, I don't resist to have some remarks about this issue. Starting for this, the first observation I'd like to make is that the European Union is an extraordinary political project that has granted a long period of peace, of food autonomy, job, wealth creation. But at least for me, the European Union, it is not exactly a country. It is not even the equivalent to the United States of America. The European Union is a union of sovereign states, and its structural and fundamental pillar is the principle of subsidiarity. And I fight very much every day in the European Parliament for the respect on the subsidiarity principle. The European Commission is not a government, not even the Council, and Brussels has no right to try to impose standards where we are really different. And I used to say that we are a mosaic, the people from Europe, we are a mosaic, from Finland to Portugal, from Italy to Spain, we are very different. And our richness is in the diversity. It is so nice for me to go to Finland and to understand that they are not the same as me, and in many things they don't think the same. So it is impossible to have Brussels saying, all of us, that we must think and behave all the same. It is something stupid as a question of principle and about what we are discussing here today. In January 2022, when presenting the priorities of the French presidency of the EU Council, Emmanuel Macron listed as one of the priorities the recognition of the right to abortion, explicit in the EU Charter, as has been said many times today for sure. What I want to say is that Emmanuel Macron has all the right to have his own position on the abortion. He just don't have the right to impose his views to me or everyone else, especially on an issue with obvious civilizational impact. And this is also politics, not only, but this is also politics. Having said that, at the political level, I want to add some very few considerations on a legal point of view. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights was proclaimed on 7 December 2000, as you must know, and became binding with the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. But to amend the Charter, unanimity is required. So for now, I'm not very much worried about what's going to happen, because unanimity is required. And it means that all the EU member states must sign and ratify it, including several states like Poland, Hungary, Malta, and Cyprus, to give 4 examples of countries that I don't believe would sign or ratify an amendment like this. But even if the Charter is amended to include the right to abortion, it would have no legal force unless the EU treaties were also revised it. On the other hand, this amendment would be incompatible with the Charter itself. The Charter applies when member states implement EU law and cannot go beyond the EU competencies. That's what Article 51 states. And as the European Commission emphasized against last year, and it was the European Commission, abortion is a matter for the member states as it is part of health policy. We can discuss if it is okay to be in the part of health policy or not, but for what matters, it is a matter for the member states. And this is a peaceful thinking. So that's why I don't believe the idea of including the abortion in the treaty as a fundamental right. This is also clearly stated in the Accession Treaty of Malta, a country which continues to absolutely prohibit the practice of abortion. The recognition of abortion is a right included in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights that, or if included on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, would deny member states the freedom to establish not only any regime of abortion prohibition like Malta, but also any more restrictive regime following the so-called indication system like Poland and many others. And this in fact is something that I would like to add to the Paulo Rangel idea about the most smart approach to fight this, because if could even be considered that a system of limitation of weeks, such as the one currently in force in most European countries, would be contrary to this supposed fundamental right. It should be noted, incidentally, that in France, it was recently approved the extension of the time limit for the legalization or liberalization of abortion to 14 weeks. But recognizing abortion as a fundamental human right would mean that any time limitation would be unacceptable, considering the treaties. So in France, we are talking about 14 weeks. In Portugal, we are talking about less weeks, but we have different conditions in many states. If you have the abortion as a human right, well, in that case, all these countries would be illegal because they would violate the treaties. And everybody could do the abortion, not depending on time, for instance. And this is something that must be said, at least I think it must be said. Finally, the right to conscience objection to the practice of abortion recognized in almost all the countries of the European Union. The exceptions are Sweden and Finland, if I don't mind, would be seriously threatened. And on this, at least, every doctor must have the right to conscience objection. Well, my father is a medical doctor, my mother too, my wife too, so at least there are 3 people at home that would never accept this thing of not having the right to say no to the possibility of an abortion. But what I must, above all, would like to highlight is the distortion that would be introduced into the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union itself by the recognition of abortion as a fundamental human right. A charter that proclaims in its very first articles the inviolability of human dignity, Article 1, and the right to life, Article 2, cannot proclaim the supposed right to suppress the life of another human being. It is a contradiction in its terms. So I'd like to finish with a political note again. When, and this is serious, when everybody is so worried about the raising of extremisms and Euroscepticisms that are growing across Europe, some policymakers fail to learn from their mistakes and seem to do their utmost to give people even more cause for anger by helping those extremisms rather than fighting them. The Christian roots of the peoples of Europe, as well as giving us our identity, are the main cement that hold us together. The enrichment of abortion as a fundamental right is a deeply divisive issue on which there is no consensus at all and which only drives us apart instead of uniting us. Whoever insists on his proclamation is taking great strides towards to long-term destruction of our common project. That's why we are not talking about abortion only. It is much more than that. Thank you so much. Well, and now, following the, I will follow the order on the paper, which means that I'll give the floor now to my good friend Miriam Lexman, member of the European Parliament from the EPP group and from Slovakia. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nuno. And thank you very much for the invitation. And also a big thank you to everyone who brought us here and is for many years fighting for human dignity and right to live and trying to influence our societies, that these values are being cherished in our society. I have been following your work, all of you who are sitting here, and many of us in member states for years, through Miroslav Mikolášik, the member of the European Parliament from my party. I joined the European Parliament in the last term, actually not from the beginning. And I have to admit that even when I speak to Miroslav, that we can admit that the situation is changing dramatically, that the fights the previous members of parliament were fighting are now seem to be like easy fights, because abortion as a right is something which goes against any logic and against anything what we could have even imagined some years ago. It actually undermines the fundamental or the fundaments of all other rights and the whole structure of protection of human dignity. And this is, I believe that this is where the kind of relativism is coming out in our society, which undermines everything what we praise as values for many years. I come from a former communist country, and I have to imagine that more and more so, I'm thinking that we are challenging a similar ideology that we did face in Slovakia during the communist times. Abortion, after all, was introduced by the Soviet Union leaders, and it is part of the Marxist image of ideal society where not God and not people of faith, but someone decides how the ideal society should look like, and it's imposed against the will of the people, and it's opposed with the loss of rights, with the loss of freedom, and a loss of lives, as we know that we had lots of martyrs in the communist countries. And I think this is the kind of fundamental issue we have to understand, what we are actually facing, that we are not facing different opinion where we can discuss. We are facing an ideology that is undermining the very basics and fundamentals of our society and of our civilization, of the Western democratic civilization, which is built on a protection of rights and freedoms, which were revealed to us Christians and maybe understood in the international communities as something which is worth of a protection. So maybe kind of the structure of what is happening in the very last years or last 2 years with the Matic report, which actually shows already that it's not only attacking the very fundamental right to life, but is already attacking also the right to the freedom of conscience and the freedom of speech, and also interfering in the member states' prerogatives and competencies of education. This is slowly eroding the structure the EU was built on. Nuno has mentioned subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is clearly showing, and it's coming from the Catholic social teaching. It's clearly dividing the roles of the European Union and the roles of the member states. And maybe I tell you one example where which I'm using very often, which explicitly explains why subsidiarity is so important. Also, maybe people who are not of our faith can understand. When China imposed ban on Lithuanian products because Lithuania has opened an office of Taiwan, and the Chinese wanted to kind of bring some political consequences. So they banned Lithuanian products or any products which had Lithuanian components. So practically any products of our member states which had Lithuanian components. I think this was a terrific attack on a common market, which is the fundamental issue the EU should deal with and protect. So when the next session was coming, I suggest that we should discuss this issue, because I believe that this is something we have to defend. I mean, this is really threatening our families, many businesses, many companies, the income of many of citizens. And I was told that there is no time because the next session, the program is already done, and they couldn't find a time for the debate on this issue. But we were discussing for 2.5 hours LGBT rights. Suddenly there was a time for this issue, which is not in a competence of the European Union. So, so maybe the kind of the argument is, that it's not only that the EU is kind of breaching the basic laws on which it was based. It's not only interfering in the competence of the member states, but it's also not doing what it fundamentally should be doing and providing for the citizens. And this is the argument I believe we should use more often, because this argument can help us to explain maybe to the general public why subsidiarity is important. Then what followed after Matic, we had Macron, which was already mentioned at the beginning of the French presidency, kind of set his own goal to introduce abortion as a right. And since then, the European Parliament, after the Roe versus Wade reverse by the Supreme Court of the United States, we were voting on a report of the European Parliament where we actually called that the right to abortion is implemented or is included into the EU Charter of Human Rights. And it was mentioned by many of the previous speakers that practically what we are facing is something which is blurring the line between true and false, between something which we can recognize by our heart or by our logic, and something we just impose on us by some ideologists. And I would refer here to that this is the relativism which is undermining our societies. And we all know that Benedict XVI, he was talking that relativism is a new form of totality. And I'm coming back where I came from, that as a young person from Slovakia, we were challenging totality. And the relativism here is a form of a new form of totality, which is kind of very slowly distracting the kind of very basics of our freedom and our society. And maybe to conclude, it was interesting that Alois Peterle, honorary Alois Peterle, has asked me during the break, and we are discussing how the situation is going down the hill, but we need to discuss what is the solution. And I have been thinking since he asked me the question, like maybe we should really discuss what is the solution. And I believe that we need to really try to reach out not only to the pro-life people, but to the general public, that our very basics of freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech are at stake. And maybe to find out those who are the silent majority, because they can help us if they would understand what's going on to make the right choices for our future. Thank you.
Well, and now I would like to give the floor to the Archduke Imre von Habsburg-Lothringen from Austria.
Thank you very much. I asked in what capacity I should talk. As you can see, there's not a lot after my name compared to all of you. So I will talk very simply as a Christian, as a Habsburg, and as a European, in this order. The EU seems to have entered a race, a great competition on a global scale, a race whose winner will boast of having written abortion as a right in its constitution. Yet, as we know, out of 27 states, 24 countries have already decriminalized abortion up to 10 weeks for the most restrictive and 24 weeks for the least restrictive. As an example, just yesterday, I put my own hand on my wife's belly to feel our baby move at 24 weeks. So why such a rush? The past few months have shown that even constitutional jurisprudence is never settled. So the EU's pro-abortion lawmakers are running to find a more permanent solution for Europe. Isn't a fundamental right a more clever way to finally get every state to accept that abortion is really a right and cannot be reversed? But my question today is the following, and this is a different perspective than what was discussed today. Where do we get this authority to decide what is a fundamental right? Who can really define the very nature of a right that is inalienable and therefore by definition inherent to human life? To answer my question, let me tell you the opinion of my uncle, Archduke Otto of Habsburg. And talking to several of you, I could see that his memory is still very alive. Archduke Otto, who served 20 years as a member of the European Parliament and who was a strong promoter of the unification of the European peoples and worked tirelessly for the liberation of the Central European countries under the Soviet yoke, countries so closely linked to our family for many centuries. Otto von Habsburg, who was also a great defender of religion, said in a 2008 interview, and I quote, "Today's crisis is a crisis of religious meaning. What I want is not so much to talk about a Christian Europe, because it is, but it's to introduce the mention of God in all important legal documents," he said. For Otto, a constitution or a charter cannot be understood without a reference to a greater authority. For the simple reason that we do not grant ourselves a fundamental right, we receive it from a higher authority. Yes, the reference to God in a constitution, as it is still the case in many constitutions in many countries, in a Charter of Human Rights, seems fundamental, because where the validity of a right is no longer anchored in an immutable higher authority, we run the terrible risk of seeing so-called fundamental rights change and fluctuate according to the majority or popular trends. We talked about human dignity, we talked also about natural law, and we also came to the conclusion that there is a very subjective element to this. But this raises an even deeper question. And my family has had the honor to play a role in several countries in Europe. And I cannot help myself to ask the question, where is Europe going? The European Union, as we know, has for decades chosen to take a different path from the one envisioned by its founders. In fact, without claiming a religious justification, Schuman, Adenauer, and de Gasperi, and many others with them, laid the foundation of a united and fraternal Europe, resolutely turned towards the future after the horrors of the 2 world wars. But never did they deny or ignore the very foundations of Europe, its Judeo-Christian roots, and by extension, its anthropology, based on an infinite dignity of the human person, a dignity that was to be preserved by all means as it comes directly from its creator. But as time went by, this mention built and the cultural, spiritual, and political heritage of Europe became more and more the target of those who wished for an unrestricted emancipation of man, a man who can become his own master, dependent on no one, and especially not on a God. But at what price? With the refusal of the European Union to mention God in its constitutive documents, or even to recognize the Christian heritage of Europe, as it was the case at the Congress of Laeken in 2001, there is a deliberate wish to free ourselves from the cultural, historical, and spiritual heritage that has formed Europe for 2 millennia. Even more important, with the rejection of the Judeo-Christian heritage comes also the rejection of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and the fundamental principles which until now have informed our laws, our culture, our anthropological vision, namely to consider man in all his dimensions and human life as sacred from conception to natural death. John Paul II says it very well, and I quote, "You can create a society without God, but it will inevitably turn itself against man." So where are we going? Europe is an old reality. It did not begin on May 9th, 1950. Europe's civilization has been shaped for centuries, and its patrimony tells us something about our future. But at a time where people, and especially the younger generation, are already desperately looking for meaning, lawmakers in Brussels are feverishly working to give the youth an identity that undermines the very foundations of Europe. Yet, at the base of a civilization, there must be a reality that is greater than it, a reality that exceeds it. Without this sacred foundation, man is doomed to the vagaries of his own desire for domination. Let us recall the terrible words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, symbol of the struggle against Soviet totalitarianism and winner of the Nobel Prize of Literature. In his speech at Harvard University in 1978, he said, "You in Europe are in an eclipse of intelligence. You have the disease of the void, soulless legalism, rationalist humanism, the abolition of the inner life. All you elites have lost the sense of higher values." Very harsh. But thank God, not all elites have lost those values. And the proof is here, with so many of you, MEPs and NGO representatives, present to stay firm in your principles. Indeed, we need more than ever courageous leaders, serving not to be popular, but to serve the truth, fighting for a united and fraternal Europe, defending the sacredness of life, promoting the family as the primary cell of society, and respecting the richness of the European peoples in their diversity, always united in the service of all, and especially the most vulnerable. We need statesmen and women who acknowledge that their power comes from an authority higher than themselves, an authority higher than opinion polls and the zeitgeist of the age. This power can only be exercised with justice for all, as it is based on immutable laws and rights written on every human heart. And the first among these is the sacred right to life. Yes, tomorrow's Europe will therefore depend on all of us, on all those who wish to continue day after day to commit themselves to serving a cause that is beyond them, a cause that is to love and serve the dignity of man, a dignity bestowed by the Creator and Author of life. Thank you very much.
Well, I must say that you don't have the doctor in this paper, but you have the Archdoc, which all of us don't have. And now I'd like to give the floor to Christian Freud from Germany, theologian and ethicist.
I will speak.
Yes, please.
Everybody can see. I will speak in English. I hope you can understand. Human rights are fundamental rights. It is the most basic rights we need. And if the denial of human rights and human interests and needs results in death or severe suffering, or the violation of human autonomy in the core area of the human being, then we speak about violation of human rights. It is the most basic thing we have. So what does it mean to introduce this right to abortion on this sphere of basic human rights? What does it mean? Does this mean if our opposition succeeds? it will be recognized that if we do not give the women the right to abort, they will be violated in their most basic autonomous right of the core area of their autonomy. Well, it is the pinnacle of protection of human rights for women, we can say. But what does it mean? It would mean, as you have told, that the European Community of States has to defend, to protect the interests of the women against all interference by others. So, like Right to Life, pro-life organizations would have a problem. Well, what are we to think of such an extension of legal protection for women? It must be remembered that human rights are constitutive of unity. The balancing of one human right against another, or the weighing up between them, violates the preservation of the constitutive unity of human rights. You cannot, you must not weigh one right to another. A right to abortion violates the constitutive principle since it fundamentally restricts the future citizen's right to life. If you have a right to abortion, the embryo has no right to life, not the full right to life. It is dependent on the mother granting the right. To avoid such a contradiction in our laws, in our human rights, we would have, it would be necessary to fundamentally deny human dignity to an embryo. That would be the consequence. You would have to say, no, an embryo has not the full dignity, human dignity. This would have far-reaching consequences, of course. At the very least, such fundamental right would disregard the Christian part of the spiritual, religious, and moral heritage you spoke of. Well, the philosophical and the religious roots of the concept of human dignity are undeniable. It is philosophically, historically undeniable where the roots lay. You cannot discuss it. The concept of human dignity is based on a philosophical, religious conception of man, as you mentioned. It is a concept of values. It thus underpins the EU Charter of Human Rights with a pre- or superpositive foundation. As someone told this afternoon, the state can only grant what is already there in the human being. So if we allow this to happen, what they plan, the ideological neutrality of the state seems to regain some ideological, some pushing. I think it would push back some of Christian influence who made Europe. If President Macron speaks of this, it's very French. It is the motivation of every French thinker who is laicist to push back Christian influence. So it is very French to do this, but it is not Polish, not Slovakish, not Maltese or whatever. There are other states in Europe. You see the problem. Further, it would have to be clarified what constitutes human dignity in terms of its content and scope. If we introduce this, we have to discuss this. And we have discussed this with no solution. We were not able to fill in the void. There were in the question of the basis on which we will build the content, we have no agreement. There are religious foundations, there are philosophical foundations, and there are empirical ways to fill it, and we can't agree. So, in which mess would be put in? We have to clarify it, but we can't. We would not be able to say with what strategy we will follow. We can have a positive way to do it. What makes human being, and we grant these rights. Or we can look at the violations and we agree this is a violation and we want to protect us from this. So in the first way, we can't agree. It is not possible to do it. We discuss it, but we can't agree. So, and in the second, we have to admit, there will be some problems. We have the question of quantitative gradations. The distinction of permissive and impermissive instrumentalization of human beings. To put it in Kantian way. We have to discuss this. So we will have to say where the demarcation lines have to be put, and we can't agree. We will be in a mess. We would create the danger of further relativization of the concept of human dignity, because we will have a discourse in our society. And how we have heard it, everything is changing in society. Which boundaries we will keep up and which we will tear down. We will not know where to go. So I think if we do this, we will tear away a big foundation of our culture and of our thinking. Because human rights and human dignity are not as easy to determine as we would like to have it. Then another thing, women, like children, have always been included in existing protection mechanisms. We have always seen that they are in a disadvantage. They are the weaker sex. And we have always seen there are situations where women are really in a, how to say, a victim situation. they are victimized. So we had to put together some protection mechanisms to protect these women in this situation. We think about women in war, women in poverty and whatever. As children, we have these children's rights, we have these women's rights. A possible right to abortion is thus understood as a special protection mechanism. Well, we can say this, okay. However, special protection mechanisms must not dissolve human rights into special rights. That is the problem we will have. Rather, it is a matter of endowing human rights with extraordinary protection from the victim's perspective, in accordance with extraordinary vulnerability. On this we can agree. But in my opinion, a right to abortion cannot claim this, since it is introduced at the expense of the embryo's right to life. And when I speak about embryos, you can speak of future citizens. Why should they not have the human dignity? They are future citizens. You can say it in this way: the equal value and worthiness of human beings is the justification of the anti-discriminatory principle of human rights. In short, human rights are egalitarian or not at all. That means my rights find their limits in the equal rights of others. The attempt to introduce a right to abortion arises from particular ideological, ethical, or political preferences. We have discussed it. The European Union thus weakens its position vis-à-vis those who, for example, make the validity of human rights dependent on their conformity with Sharia law. The EU thus exposes itself to accusations of arbitrariness. We have heard it. We are aggressively doing our thing and introducing our ideas to Africa. The only right to do this is we have more money than others and we have more power than others, so we can do it. Is this justified? I do not think so.
Bueno, y ahora es tiempo de escuchar a Isabel Benjumea, mi amiga y eurodiputada de España, que además habla muy bien inglés.
Thank you, Nuno, very much. Thank you very much, one of us and Universidad San Pablo CEU for organizing this very important event. For me, it's a pleasure to be here, and especially to be in front of Jaime. Jaime Mayorreja has been a fighter for the cause of life for decades, and he's an example. So thank you very much for being here and for the invitation. I'll be brief. I know you have another roundtable right after this. I do agree with most of the things that have been said, and I think that and I wanted to, in my intervention, make a call to action. I mean, first of all, I would like to start by acknowledging that we are a minority. We are a minority right now. When President Macron addressed the European Parliament, representing the European presidency, because it's in the capacity that he did it, the biggest round of applause that he received was from the plenary when he said that he wanted the abortion to become a human right. It was a huge round of applause. And he said that along with a comment he said that he wanted to reform the chapter of human rights of the European Union regarding preserving the environment and the right to abortion. And he put it at the same level, the fight against the climate change and abortion. And he received the huge round of applause. So we need to acknowledge we're a minority. And we are a minority not only within the European Parliament. We are happy to be here. We are fighting constantly and we'll keep on doing it. But first we need to acknowledge it. And then we have to ask ourselves why. We have all the great argumentation and all the technical argumentation. And I can easily say that I know that I'm right when I say that an abortion cannot be a human right. But truth to be said is that most of the society doesn't agree with us. Most of the society believes it's the woman's right and it should be recognized as a human right. So we need to start our battle from these organizations, from one of us, from our capacity at the European Parliament, from many associations that work around Europe in this case, to really asking ourselves, do we really know we're a minority and we really know we need to get out of the rooms? We need to go and fight the battle of defending life in their terms. We need to go into the public sphere. We need to confront using their language. We need to start, for instance, the battle of the labels. When we accept that whenever we talk about abortion, we talk about reproductive rights. We need to start reconquering the language and starting calling the things by their name, so that at least people understand what we're saying when we are talking about abortion. So that's the first call to action that I always try to say, and I say I do try to do it in my own sphere, but I do believe we need to do it in all the spheres. Then the most important thing is that, of course, we want to achieve an objective, which is we don't want abortions in Europe. It's not only that we don't want them in the chapter in the human rights chapter, is that we don't want abortions to happen in Europe. So we need to start thinking further in what is it that can prevent those abortions to happen. And for me, the answer is family, and it's protection to the family, and it's protection to women, and it's giving solutions to women who are pregnant. We live in Europe right now where feminism is now the new religion, among others, but one of the new religions. Okay, so let's start bringing into the discussion, how is it that we don't want to protect women by giving them options, by giving them solutions whenever they come to confront the decision whether or not they want a baby. We need to really play the game from a different perspective, because if we only do it from the theoretical perspective and from the theological perspective, which I totally agree with and which I consider is the right approach, but it's true to be said, it's not working. So we really need to react, and we need to become activists, and we need to get out of our circles, and we have to stop talking to people who is already convinced, and we really need to start fighting this very long and complex battle from a different perspective. For me, there are three things that have been said that I totally agree with. First of all, is something that Miriam said, that we need to give it a broader perspective. It's not only the right to life, it's the right of objection of conscience, and it's the freedom of speech. Those are two very fundamental rights that are under stake, and that we need to put them within the same battle. Second is acknowledging that what we really need to fight against is relativism. Relativism in terms of the new totalitarianism, as Pope Benedict said. Well, that means starting to say no and stopping to say I'm sorry. And these are the two main things that we need to start doing, not only the political sphere, but also in the personal sphere. And I believe it's very important. And thirdly is that we need to understand that this is not only a battle that is played in a small scope, which is how to address the topic of abortion regarding whether or not it's a right. If you go through the legislation we have to deal with every plenary in Strasbourg, you will find the word abortion in texts that talk about financial legislation. You'll find the word abortion in texts that talk about a single market. You'll find abortion in, I would say, half of the texts that we vote in the parliament. and LGBT and many others. No, but as we are talking about, no, of course. But that's the point. So we really need to understand that we are fighting against people that are very well organized, that have managed to introduce it in many of the legislation texts that we have to deal with, that are in control of the language, and that we are constantly reacting and we are not proactive. And I do believe that precisely in this topic that we are discussing now, we are not seeing, and I will end with this, we are not seeing the full picture of the situation. Macron said it, he got the huge support of the European Parliament. Not everybody, but a large majority started to clap, and it was a huge reaction. Then many member states react to it by saying they agreed on that. They wanted to make that move, to that step forward. That's the expression, okay? And then if you start to see, already we've got resolutions talking about it. Already we've got proposals of new debates in the parliament to start talking about it. So we are preparing the grounds, and I cannot agree more with Nuno on what he said, is that unanimity right now, it's what will prevent us from this change in the treaties, right? But again, there's another debate on right now is around unanimity and the right to veto. And we really need to be playing the battle in all the fields to understand that if we want to win the battle defending life, we need to really understand all the battlefields that we need to be part of, and really get out of the small community and get into the different battlefields, which I believe it's language, it's understanding that we need to enlarge the objective of protection of family and of protection of natality, and also the protections of, why not, the rights of women to have a choice, and the choice is to have answers and to have options. And what is more important, to make a clear strategy within the European Parliament, within the Commission and the Council, so that we can tackle all the options that all the tools that they'll be using to make this change, so that we can be there first, and we can have all the solid argumentation that we've heard from our two speakers to use it and to be there in place. So I will say that this is a very important event. It's important that we bring this discussion to Brussels, but it's important to acknowledge that we are a minority, but we need to be an active minority, and we need to be really prepared to fight and to make it in a very clever way a success. And that success will only go if we stop believing that only by being right will be in the possibility to win the battle. So I hope that with one of us, with Etheu, and with all the wonderful people you have in the panels, and with you, all of you, we can start to a little bit to change the strategy, because we agree what we want to achieve. And a great example, and I'll finish with that Miriam mentioned, was the Matic report. Even though we didn't win at the end, we were able to get a large number of members of parliament who previously wouldn't vote against abortion to vote against the Matic report. And that was thanks to a strategy that was well thought. And of course, it was not enough, but it was an example to follow. Thank you.
You are totally right about the unanimity issue, but the truth is that in all the political groups, you have lots of MEPs fighting for the end of the unanimity rule, even in our own group. And I don't know if we are not a minority in that issue as well. But having said that, I must ask the organization if you have time for a few questions, or we must put an end and give the stage to other.
Yeah, we are going to give you the opportunity to make some questions, but we have like 10 minutes. So please make very clear and short questions, okay? Raise your hands. We will bring you the micro. Whatever.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Bros. I work as an assistant in the European Parliament, and I will use the opportunity to ask a bit of a provocative question, a challenging question for the MEPs from EPP, but in a friendly manner, okay? So given what we have heard about the state of the European Union, would you agree with me that as the members of the largest political group, and also the group itself, the EPP, should reconsider the very strong push for European federation, because it's obvious that the Europe that will be federal, where all the sovereignty will be removed from the member states and will be given to, to one center in Brussels, it will be very easy to impose anything we don't like, everything we fight against. So again, the question is, would you think it would be wise to think again about the federal Europe? Thank you very much.
Understanding that for the MEPs, I'll be very short. I mean, I constantly have this debate, and for me, I'm absolutely in favor of federal Europe. But the point is that you are accepting, I want to win the battle of ideas. I want to be comfortable in a Europe that defends the idea I believe in. So from your approach, you're accepting that if there were a European government and if there are no sovereign member states, there is no chance to fight. There is no chance to defend the values we believe in, and there's no chance. So you've already decided that the battle is lost. And that's what I don't accept. That's what I don't accept. I think we really need to win the battle of ideas, change the way right now the majority of politicians think, and we really need to change society. And I don't accept that we need to acknowledge that only certain member states will be the guarantee of the values I believe in. No, I'm very sorry, but I don't. So I don't like to center the discussion on a federal Europe or a sovereign Europe. I'm sorry, I want to say I'm in favor of sovereign Europe, but in any case, if I were a federalist, I would want a Europe defending my values. So I won't accept that only a sovereign member states are that can block, that can veto, are the ones that can maintain and that can stop Europe from this going down the hill. I believe that we need to think bigger and think on the future generations and think about changing society, and winning the battle of ideas. And we need, and because I believe that that's the only way. If not, we are starting the battle by assuming that we've lost the battle. That's the way I see it.
Well, I'm the other side of our political group, because I'm not a federalist at all. I believe in a union of sovereign states, but a union with obviously a huge market, social rights, the freedom to be all over and to work wherever you want, but with national governments. I don't want the United States of America, and neither I want the Commission transformed in a European government. Even more, if you think in the solution that Macron, for instance, wants for us of having a European Commission transformed in a European government, but not with ministers from all the countries, which in the end could mean to have ministers from all the nationalities, but not the Portuguese saying about what we must do in Portugal. And for me, that's nonsense. And that's the best way to destroy Europe in the end. And in fact, it is important that in our groups, we can have both tendencies. And I'm looking at Elisabetta Cardini. I used to vote with her before in these kind of issues. But anyway, that's why unanimity is so important. Veto is so important. Now people wants to, many leaders wants to launch European taxes. We don't pay the same taxes all over. One tax would have different and substantial effects in different countries, because in my country, it is a nightmare what we pay, talking about taxes. And so it would not mean the same tax paid in Germany or in Portugal or in Spain. But that's why I really believe these are dangerous steps. But that's another issue. Very interesting, but for another round table. So I'll give the floor to Mike.
Maybe we can take a few questions and try to answer all them together, because otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. And
Merci. Je venais du Portugal, de la Fédération pour la vie, et je veux demander quelqu'un qui est ici pour demander à Monsieur Macron le droit fondamental pour l'abort sera presque à quel temps de gestation? 10 semaines, 24 semaines ou 9 mois. Je pense que cette est la réponse, la demande principale de cette question. Parce que s'il est un droit fondamental, il aura être permis presque les 9 mois.
Merci.
Moi.
Please.
I don't know if we can maybe take one more question.
Merci,
and
merci.
like that we answer both
Would you
of
like me
them.
to translate?
Vous avez bien compris ou il faut... Oui,
Très bien.
c'est bien compris? Ok. One more question maybe? Or we start with answering them? Okay, so maybe you can answer them.
My dear friend doesn't believe in the moderator. So please.
I will maybe react to the question which I was given a translation of, and I would just say a quote from Ronald Reagan, who said, "I have noticed that everyone who is for abortion has already been born." And I think this is the answer to Macron, and I think he needs to know this, because the debate about amount of months is a debate which would never finish. But let me touch upon the federal Europe. I am also against federal Europe, although I have to say that for me, the question is not federal or not federal. The question is that I'm for subsidiary Europe. Europe which is based on a subsidiarity principle, because we know that this principle is something which works. And that's the kind of backbone of the European Union. And then I tell you very shortly that I actually meet people who believe that if we have a federal Europe, that means that the principle of subsidiarity will be better implemented, because everything will be part of the constitution or a law. And there are many legal arguments for this, but my very practical argument against this is actually the United States, where we see the court activism. No one is now questioning that the decision on Roe v. Wade in 1973 was against the US Constitution. And the court made a decision, and it has a fatal consequences on all the states of the United States. So for me, the activism of the courts and breaching of constitutions and laws of the courts and tweaking the meaning of the basics of our law and the fundamental rights and basis on which democracy and freedoms are based, this is my argument against federal Europe, because I believe that federal Europe will not be able to uphold the subsidiarity, and strong member states could do it better. But the thing is that unfortunately, I see the member states failing in protecting of their own interests. And this is something which we need to, again, this is another issue where I believe we can gain more support if we would be more vocal about this tendency. Thank you.
Christine?
What was the question, the second one?
Second one about Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah.
She wants to say to Macron that she wants to Macron to explain if the abortion should be at 10 weeks, 14 weeks, or 9 months.
If you speak of a fundamental right to abortion, you will not speak about weeks, because it's a fundamental right to do it. Because you think it violates the core thing of your autonomy. So it does not depend on whether it is 1 week or 9 months. It is the first step to infanticide, because you will start with this and then you will have infanticide, because you will have to speak about what is a human being, what is human dignity. And it is autonomous, is self-consciousness, it is self-awareness and all this kind. Babies do not have it, embryos do not have it. Comatose, permanent comatose persons do not have it. Some radically disabled persons do not have it, so they have no dignity, so you can finish the life of them. It will begin with one thing and go to another, and we will have a permanent discussion, a discourse. And no to this.
I am not a politician, but I know that it's very valuable to have the last word. So thank you. But I would just say, I mean, everything was said, but maybe the last little comment I would add is that there seem to be a little bit two movements. On one side, nationalists, those who want less and less power in Brussels, more and more power at the country level, and only the country level, that regards the EU as something that needs to go away. So it's we see this very strongly now in many countries of Europe, this nationalistic movements. On the other side, those who are more in favor of a federalist Europe with more power in Brussels, which brings the question of how competencies are again being shared among the different levels. And I really think, and this was said several times, there's really a third way that we can work in, is to give again this sovereignty to the different countries, which in fact is already the case. But if we apply justly the principle of subsidiarity, then we can really share the competences at every single level. And I live in Geneva, Switzerland, and we have there a model that is very interesting with different cantons. It's still a federal state, but every canton has a lot of power and it works very well. Maybe this is something that we can brainstorm about in the next panel.